Module 3, Communicating Across Cultures. In Module 1 of our textbook, it really begins to talk about how to make business communication effective. And Module 2 deepens that knowledge by specifically analyzing how we can adapt our messages to specific audiences. Module 3 then is intended to take that even further and to really think about the kinds of audiences, the different backgrounds and values and beliefs and practices that may affect our communication within the workplace. In today's world with technology, with an increasingly global and multinational corporate structure, it is not unlikely that on a daily basis you may have interactions with people from various cultures. I have a friend who works for a multinational corporation, and he's been on conference calls where he's not only talking to someone in Ireland, but also someone in China, all at the same time on the same phone call. And so navigating these kinds of cultural differences becomes a really part of good business practice. And as our book says, quote, valuing diversity is good business as well as good social practice. It's really a necessary skill in today's global economy. So what is culture? Culture is our understanding of acceptable actions and beliefs. It's the kind of habitual practices that we've been accustomed to, and it provides us with a pattern or a frame of reference for what we think is correct or the correct way to do things. However, of course, we know that everyone comes from different backgrounds, and all of these different cultures and backgrounds have slightly different frames. And so that can really, sometimes they come into conflict even, and we have to think about how we can adapt our messages and really communicate with people who may have slightly different beliefs about what's correct or polite than we do. Our book talks specifically about high context versus low context cultures. In high context cultures, the relationships or situation, the roles that people play within that situation are really what communicate most strongly and are most valued and most important. And so in that case, sometimes verbal communication is more indirect. There's a deference to politeness. And interestingly, oral contracts are often binding in these cultures. So your word is your bond. And so there's kind of a de-emphasis on the word, except in cases where it's really important, and then it's seen as binding. Arabic cultures, Japanese culture, they're kind of seen as high context cultures. On the other hand, low context cultures are like American culture. We tend to emphasize less the roles and relationships between people and focus more on the communication itself. Very verbal cultures, often very direct, which can be seen as somewhat confrontational or even offensive to those from other cultural backgrounds. And in our case, in the American culture, written contracts are considered what's binding. And that's really the frame that our business writing class comes from, is that these kinds of written documents are really considered records in low context / American culture. And so they become highly important. Why are we studying this? Well, culture influences all kinds of communication acts. Our frame of reference tells us how to show politeness and respect, how much information we should give, who we should give it to, what's the best channel or how to give that information, what reader benefits or different kinds of incentives will motivate people. And it also dictates what we consider appropriate in terms of loudness, the size of the paper, the formality of the correspondence, whether it's appropriate to speak verbally or in person, or whether or not you need a contract or some kind of document in order to verify. And so we really want to learn how to be sensitive to people's preferences and how to communicate across these cultural lines, to think and analyze whether or not some of these different values, beliefs, practices may be part of where miscommunication is happening rather than some kind of interpersonal issue. However, we also want to really recognize that generalizations about culture don't apply to all individuals within a culture. And in fact, our book points out that discourse communities can often have stronger cultural values or values that are much more influential on a person than their home or native culture. And so our professional or organizational culture are in the mix too. I'll show you some pictures here. So for instance, scientists have a set of values, practices, methods that actually extend across cultures a lot of the time and may be even more relevant or important than their home or native culture, and may, kind of negate any cultural differences that people would bring to that communication situation. Again, I have a picture of an Olympic gymnast. Clearly, people who are very specialized in the work that they do, in the kinds of experiences they share, and those kinds of things may supersede any kind of home or native culture background. Those values may be primary for those people. However, in studying culture, we really want to recognize that what we're trying to do is be more flexible and adapt our messages to really communicate effectively. And we want to avoid, though, using cultural generalizations in a way that's discriminatory or sort of lazily falls into stereotyping. Some of the ways to avoid these things are to realize that your own preferred values and behaviors are just that. They're a part of your cultural frame and not necessarily better or right, okay? Everyone comes to the table with a frame. And so none of those are better than the others. We just have to figure out how to navigate the waters between them. You want to try to be flexible and open to change, and be observant and sensitive to others' cues and preferences. Make yourself kind of a connoisseur. Be aware of other cultural practices, values, and beliefs. Can be very interesting to learn about those things, and we can just really become kind of very aware and observant as to how those might affect our communication situations in different situations. The key thing here, I think, is really to respect others as individuals and recognize that while you may think you know something about someone's culture, it doesn't necessarily mean you know anything about them as an individual person. So we really want to interact with people one-on-one, understand them, be observant of their personal preferences, and while we're aware of their culture and how that might affect our communication, don't make assumptions. Don't assume that's the end-all be-all. Again, here we have an example of a harmful stereotype. Those kinds of things are not true of all individuals in a culture, and those kinds of things can lead to discriminatory practices in the workplace. We want to avoid stereotyping. What communicates? Well, all kinds of nonverbal communication is really patterned based on our culture. Our book talks about open versus closed body positions. This is something I'm very aware of in terms of interviews. I try to avoid crossing my arms because that's seen as a very defensive posture. Eye contact is interpreted differently across high context versus low context cultures. In high context cultures, lowering your eyes may be seen as deference or a sign of respect or politeness, whereas in low context cultures, it's seen as less direct and therefore is sometimes seen as suspicious. Different hand gestures mean different things in different cultures. The thumbs up and okay signals can actually be offensive to certain people, and so you just want to be aware of that and be careful about that. Personal space is very culturally influenced. In low context cultures like American culture, we have very large personal space. And so any invasion of personal space can be seen as very aggressive or somewhat suspicious. Whereas in other cultures, personal space is not such a big issue. People don't have such wide personal space, and it's very common for people to sit and stand very close to one another, which can feel uncomfortable for those of us who are from different cultural backgrounds. Touch is something you want to be very aware of and very careful about. Our book points out that even in direct cultures, it's often a power signal, that people who are more powerful seem to have the right to touch others who are not, and it's not true vice versa. And so I would just, avoid touching people in the workplace unless you really have established a personal relationship where that's appropriate. Even just pats on the back, those kinds of things. In different cultures, different people of opposite genders don't ever touch in public, and so you don't want to create a situation where you make someone uncomfortable. So just really be aware of those kinds of things. We've talked about how spatial arrangements can communicate power. If someone sits at the head of the table, that's often seen as a power position, and that can shift, however, in different cultural settings. And sense of time, our book really talks about how in certain cultures time is money. In monochronic cultures, we really see time as this fixed thing, whereas in polychronic cultures, it's really based on relationships and emotions, and so it would be seen as more disrespectful to cut someone off than it would be to be late. Whereas in a monochronic culture like American culture, being late is really considered disrespectful. Conversational style is influenced by culture as well as generational changes. And so that can be anything from exaggeration to how you give compliments, to whom you give compliments, how you give thanks, when you give thanks, whether silence communicates refusal or confusion. Our book talks about how Gen X inflects their statements. That has to do with the tone. So they have a rising tone at the end of statements, not only questions, which can seem like not knowing or indecision to other generations. And so those kind of conversational styles are really specific to time and place. They're specific to certain cultures and generations. And so you just want to be aware. Again, we're trying to be observant. We're trying to be aware of any kind of noise or influences that might affect our communication and result in miscommunication. And so we just want to take a step back and say, is this really some kind of interpersonal thing, or is it something that I'm bringing my cultural frame to the table and misinterpreting the situation? And can I step back and find a way to better communicate with this person who I'm trying to work with? Okay, I'm going to stop the video here in order to give you time to process that, and then we'll come back with a second video and talk about specifically using inclusive language, or as our book talks about it, avoiding biased language, using bias-free language.